All right, welcome. So today you can see that the category or the topic is photosynthesis, although we're just going to be talking about the very basics of photosynthesis. What we're going to see is that photosynthesis is the process by which we take carbon dioxide, which is CO2, water, which we know as H2O, in sunlight, or at least light, and use those three things to convert the carbon dioxide in the water into glucose and oxygen, which is O2. Our whole goal is going to be to figure out the basics of how this happens, what the process is, and why it's so important. Eventually what we'll talk about is cellular respiration, and we'll see how the two tie together and are kind of like a dynamic duo, like peanut butter and jelly. But first, in order to fully understand photosynthesis, we must be able to understand what a chemical reaction is. So in a chemical reaction, you have two parts. Here we got a chemical reaction between hydrogen and oxygen to form water. As I said before, there's two parts to this. So the first part is the stuff you start with. The stuff that you start with is the stuff that's going to react. So we call that the reactant side. On the opposite side, we have the stuff that's made, the stuff that you produce. So that we call that side the products. The arrow, of course, means yields. So that's telling me that we're taking what we start with and we're forming something new. It's a chemical change, a chemical reaction there. In the chemical change or chemical reaction, we will see that all that happens is that the atoms that make up the reactants are rearranged around to make up the products. So we're not adding in anything new, we're not taking anything away, nothing's being forgotten about, everything's just being changed. That's called the law of conservation of matter. In order to uphold this law, we have to balance the equation. Hopefully you've learned how to balance the equation before. I'm not going to go through how to do that, but hopefully you remember how to do that. So here you would need 2 waters and 2 hydrogens in order to make the number of atoms equal on each side. Now you have 4 hydrogens on the reactants, 4 hydrogens on the products. You have 2 oxygens on the reactants, and 2 times 1 or 2 oxygens on the products. So right there we see that we have the same exact number of atoms that we started with on the reactants and product side, and the same exact types of atoms. So that tells me that everything was conserved there. That's going to be important to us because what we're going to be able to see is that in photosynthesis, all we're doing is we're taking our reactants and rearranging them around in order to get a different type of product. Okay, so I'm going to come up with a little analogy for you here. We got the chemical equation at the top. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to pretend like I have some building blocks. Kind of like Legos, but not Legos because I don't want to get sued for copyright infringement. So building blocks here, and I put 2 red building blocks together, and I put 2 blue building blocks together. And then I decide, hey, you know what? I really want to make a red building block attached to a blue building block attached to a red building block in that exact order. So what I'm going to have to do first, if I'm going to make it from these guys over here, the very first thing I'm going to have to do is what? If you answered pull those building blocks apart, you're right. I'm going to have to rip apart the red building blocks, rip apart the blue building blocks, so that I can rearrange them so that I go red, blue, red. Alright? Just like that, we're going to look at a chemical reaction, and we're going to see that in our chemical reaction, we have 2 hydrogens in this example, 2 oxygens together in this example, and we want to make 2 hydrogens attached to an oxygen. Alright? What we're going to have to do in order to rearrange those atoms is the exact same thing we had to do with the building blocks. We're going to have to break them apart. So we're going to have to get in there and we're going to have to snap that bond, break that bond, and snap those atoms apart so that they can rearrange in order to make the water molecule over here. This is true for any chemical reaction. And that energy that's needed in order to break apart those atoms is called activation energy. So activation energy is the energy that's needed to start a reaction. That means it's going to break apart what we're starting with. It's going to break apart what we're starting with in order to get the reaction to start to go. That energy that we have to put in, that energy is going to have to be put in by some outside source. We're going to have to put in some sort of energy. Just like if you imagine you were trying to snap a pencil, you have to put in some sort of energy to snap the pencil. So if you made it this far, you're probably sitting there thinking, okay, what the heck does this have to do with photosynthesis? Why is he just rambling on and talking about this? And you probably got a good point. But why we're talking about that is because photosynthesis is a chemical reaction. And it's really important that we understand what happens in a chemical reaction to fully understand what's happening in photosynthesis. So if you remember, we said that we need 3 things in photosynthesis. We need carbon dioxide, water, and the sun. But first what we need is an autotroph. As you guys know, an autotroph is an organism that makes its own energy. Auto means self, troph means energy. So an autotroph makes its own energy. Typically we think of plants when we think of photosynthesis, although protists like the euglenas we looked at can undergo photosynthesis as well. In order to undergo photosynthesis, there's a requirement that that organism must have one type of organelle in its cells, or at least part of its cells. And that organelle is called the chloroplast. So all autotrophs that undergo photosynthesis need that chloroplast. All right, so that's my not so great drawing of a chloroplast there. But all autotrophs that undergo photosynthesis need that chloroplast. That's where everything happens. Inside the chloroplast is a green pigment. A pigment is something that absorbs sunlight or any type of light. And that green pigment is called chlorophyll. So there's a green pigment in there called chlorophyll. That's why plants are green. That's why the euglena's chloroplasts were green. It's that chlorophyll. And that's what actually intakes the sunlight during photosynthesis. So now that we're in the chloroplast, what actually occurs for photosynthesis is you take carbon dioxide, which is CO2, and water, which is H2O, and you react them. They're your reactants in order to produce oxygen, which is O2, and glucose. Glucose is a sugar. It ends in OSE. Anything that ends in OSE is a sugar. So like lactose, if you're lactose intolerant, you can't drink the sugar in milk. Fructose, sucrose, those are probably ones that you've heard of before as well. OSE means sugar. Glucose is a sugar, which means it's a carbohydrate. It's pretty important that we get that carbohydrate. Glucose has a fancy chemical formula. Its fancy chemical formula is C6H12O6. That's glucose. If we balance out that formula, we'll see that you need 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters in order to make 6 oxygens in one singular glucose molecule. So for every single one glucose that you make, you need 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters. All that's happening here, is that the carbon dioxide and the water are being broken apart and rearranged in order to make oxygen in the glucose, the one glucose. So you got to take the 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters. What would break apart those carbon dioxides and waters, though? What would be the activation energy? What would start our reaction? Well, hopefully you remember that in order for this to occur, we need sunlight, or at least some sort of light source. So light source acts as the activation energy here, and it activates the breaking of carbon dioxide and the water into their individual atoms so that they can be arranged into the C6H12O6 huge giant molecule and O2s. Alright, so if we actually draw out glucose, you see it's just ginormous. It's down on the bottom there. It's in the green. Lots of atoms, lots of bonds compared to carbon dioxide, which is up here, and water, which is over here. Again, the saber breaking out. Glucose is a lot bigger. It has a lot of chemical bonds. That's really significant because that means that glucose has a lot of stored potential energy or stored chemical energy. Right? Energy is stored in chemical bonds. The more chemical bonds, the more energy we're going to have stored. The reason why we get so much energy when, if you look up at carbon dioxide and water and they don't have that much energy, the reason why we get so much more energy when we build glucose is it has so many more bonds, and that extra energy came from the sun. So it's taking the sun's energy to compact itself with some more energy. Well, the whole entire purpose or reason why photosynthesis occurs, the whole entire reason why photosynthesis occurs is to take light energy and convert it into stored chemical energy. So people always think that the purpose or the whole idea of photosynthesis is that it makes energy for the plant. And in a way, that's kind of true. But it's not directly true. A plant couldn't just survive just doing photosynthesis. It needs to make cell energy. Glucose is not cell energy. Glucose is stored chemical energy. Glucose has all those bonds that store energy. What we're going to see is glucose, I compare it to a bank. Glucose, just like the bank, holds on to something. The bank holds on to your money. Glucose holds on to energy. And that's the energy from the sun or the light source. And what glucose does with that energy is it just keeps it. It holds it there. It's a carbohydrate. It stores that energy until it's needed. At that point in time, the mitochondria is going to take the glucose and it's going to extract the energy from glucose in order to make and build ATP. ATP, we learned, is actual usable cell energy. That can actually be used. The energy that's in glucose, though, just sits there and acts as a store. Glucose is the bank for that energy until it's time to build ATP. But all of that is called cellular respiration, and that's down the road. Right now, we're just going to finish up here with photosynthesis. So, light energy to store chemical energy is the purpose of photosynthesis. The method by which this is done, method means how it's done. The method is to use light energy to break carbon dioxide down and break water down and rearrange those into glucose and oxygen. That extra energy that the sun provides is stored in glucose. So now glucose has a ton of energy. The plant has just harvests a bunch of energy from the light. And what we'll see the next step is that we as humans or an animal or even the plant itself is going to take that glucose and break it down to actually get usable cell energy out of it. That right there is photosynthesis in a nutshell. What we've got to do is we've got to figure out how do our reactants get into our plant. So I'm going to draw us a beautiful picture here. You know my artwork is Picasso-esque, which means good. Alright, so we got a rose, a sun, and some grass. So you know it's a rose. I'll put some thorns on there. There we go. Okay. First thing that we need for photosynthesis is we need that light energy. How does that light energy enter our plant? Well, how it enters is through the chloroplasts, and specifically the chlorophyll. Chlorophyll absorbs wavelengths from the sun, and it traps that energy in so that photosynthesis, this whole process, can begin. The second thing that we need for photosynthesis is water. So we get some rain. How the plant gets water inside of it is through its root system. So plants have roots underneath the ground. Those roots absorb the water. I want to use blue there. blue, absorb the water, and that water goes up into the plant, and now the plant has water. Lastly, we know that the plant needs carbon dioxide. Black's not going to show up on black. So CO2 there. And that CO2 needs a way to get into the plant as well. So this is the one that's a little more not be quite as familiar with. We got a leaf here. My leaves are actually pretty good compared to maybe my other art. On the bottom side of the leaf, there's little pores. Those little pores are kind of like the pores in your face, or really the pores on any part of your skin. All right, they're little openings. Those little openings allow carbon dioxide to go in and oxygen to exit the plant. Those pores have a name. They're called the stomata. The stomata let in carbon dioxide and let out oxygen. The roots let in water, and the chlorophyll in the chloroplast absorbs the sunlight. All right, there you have it. That's all we're going to talk about for photosynthesis for right now. We'll come back to it later on, so stay tuned. Our next topic, though, will be the basics of cellular respiration. So you'll figure out what happens to glucose once it's made.